ask questions, and I go by Liz as my nickname. And while my appointment's out here, I'm also based at the Primate Center, so I'm sure you've heard a lot about what's going on in the news with us there. And so a lot of interesting things going on right now, but I hope you'll find this topic interesting and hopefully thought-provoking as well. A lot of issues that I'm going to sort of talk about have a lot of thought behind them in terms of different ways of looking at things, and I hope it'll at least sort of open your mind into considering things from different points of view. So what I usually like to start this talk with this quote from Dr. Bernard Davis writing about stormover biology, where he says that ever since the discovery of fire and of cutting tools, it has been clear that virtually any scientific knowledge can be used for good or ill. The costs and benefits depend entirely on how it's used. So we have different points of view, and anything that can be used for good can probably be used for bad. And so there's a lot of concerns about intended and unintended consequences that we sometimes have to consider. This is a little bit dated, but many of the scientific communities and organizations to which we belong and to which we subscribe to journals have been interested in this topic as well, bridging, the science and society, issues on One Health, attaining optimal health for people, animals, and the environment. And as a mission statement for the American Association for the Advancement of Science, their mission is not so much about only the advancement of science just for science's sake, but rather advancing science and serving society. So that's sort of the context in which this talk is being presented. So in that context, of course, there's a desire to improve the human condition, but there also needs to be attention given to social and natural sciences that can influence or also fail to influence public policy. One of the major publications from which many of these topics for discussion are being presented in the context of responsible conduct of research come from this publication from the Office of Research Integrity. This is still the most recent edition, and you have or will hear talks about shared values, regulations, misconduct, methods for or approaches for planning research that include discussion of conflict of interest regulations, the use of humans and animals. I don't know if you've heard about the IACUC yet or the IRB, and also conducting research, how data is managed, the trainee mentorship relationship, collaborations, and then of course fair peer review, and then discussing authorship and publications. And then in the context of all this, our talk today is about the role of the scientist in society. I like this chart that's in this publication, indicating that there's a lot of different paths we can take when we're doing our research. And of course, they meander off in different directions, but eventually you can always get back onto that, straight, narrow path. But the main criteria that are important responsibilities as scientists are, of course, honesty, accuracy in our data reporting, efficiency, not wasting, and objectivity, playing devil's advocate with the work that we're doing. And much of these activities are regulated through professional codes, government regulation, institutional policies, and personal convictions, which always play into that as well. So one of the editorials that I still like to work with was published 10 years ago by the then editor of Science magazine, in which he talks about science's impact on society, and that primarily society or public opinion about science is fairly positive. And he states in here that the common thread is that science and its products are intersecting more frequently with certain human beliefs and values. But what's really important to consider is that as science encroaches more closely on heavily value-laden issues, members of the public are claiming a stronger role in both the regulation of science and the shaping of the research agenda. And so that's where we really, as scientists, sort of become part of that interface. And in previous lectures or seminars that I've given in this topic, there's been a huge growth in online journals, free access journals, which have increased, dramatically over these time periods. And the American Academy for the Advancement of Science American Association for the Advancement of Science, excuse me, also has a huge working group that engages the public through workshops between government officials, policymakers, and scientists to help bridge some of those gaps in understanding and different perspectives. But what's really changed our role in in society is just that social media explosion. And I actually found this on Wikimedia, and I was absolutely blown away by all the different types of interfaces that we have with the public, between Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and things like that. But these are all different forms of interactions through blogging, video, you name it, news, journalism, and so on. And so this really impacts, 10 years later, this is still so extremely important that the public is playing a greater role, and that as we interface in social media, that we really can affect how the society perceives what we do as scientists. So dimensions of science and society include benefits as well as risks, and these are all sort of ensconced in values that include morals, ethics, philosophy, cultures, religion, tradition, heritage, and financial costs. So our role in society has a lot of different kinds of interfaces and relationships. As professional scientists, we're involved in the public through academia, through the government, through international agencies, and also privately in academia through for-profit and not-for-profit organizations and non-government organizations. Our scientific activities are also somewhat interfaced with funding sources that include the government, like the NIH, non-government organizations, private, for-profit, not-for-profit, and society interfaces, just how we interact with our scientific knowledge and how that affects policy through legislation, for example. That's affected by culture, religion, family, friends, community, and then what we as a country do scientifically also impacts the rest of the world and vice versa. So the society point of view, if you will, still expresses an enthusiasm for science. There's political support for scientific research, at least in this country and in many other countries. The government places a lot of money and funding, taxpayer dollars, into institutes like the National Institutes of Health, National Science Foundation, and so on. But there's also an interest in fundamental practicality or pragmatism for product-driven research that improves our health and lifestyle. But there are also consequences for those actions that the society is also interested in. Safety, of course, is a big concern of society. And again, society imposes values, culture, ethical, and moral boundaries. As a scientist, of course, we go into science for a quest for knowledge. And theoretically, one could argue that knowledge is ethically neutral, but it's the application of our scientific knowledge, how it's used, that can raise ethical concerns. So process is part of this. And then the benefit of the science that we produce has both realized impact and benefit, as well as potential. In other words, basic science can lead to applied science that then can have an impact. As a scientist citizen, we're involved as scientists in terms of concept, research, data, and interpretation of data. And it's when we publish and communicate that information that there then becomes a balance with communication and how that information is applied through public policy. And of course, as scientists, we're also playing a role in education that helps inspire people to learn more about science, and that, of course, makes life easier in terms of getting funding that then can go back and benefit society. What's interesting, though, is that the public perception of science and scientists is shifting a little bit. And this is a publication that literally just came out this past January through the Pew Research Center that was commissioned by the AAAS, in which they looked at the public views and the views of adults in the public and society, as well as views of scientists on basic concepts in science and society. And I'm going to show you just a couple of graphs on some of the output on these results. But basically, both public and scientists value the contribution of science, but there's some large differences on how each group perceives scientific issues. However, both groups agree that, at least in the United States, that K through 12 science, technology, engineering, and math education fall behind that of other nations. What I really wanted to focus on is not so much the education, but the scientific perceptions about scientific issues that scientists versus other adults not in the sciences view. This is a graph showing some major biomedical and climatic, energy, and space issues, such as whether it's safe to eat genetically modified foods, the use of animals in research. This one surprised me a little. Whether it's safe to eat foods, and so on. And what this shows is what non-scientific adults perceive as favorable and what the scientists would see. And for example, safety in eating generically modified foods is probably the largest gap between how scientists and societies view this topic. 37% feel it's safe of adults, but while 88% of scientists. So huge gaps in some of these topics. What surprised me was favoring the use of animals in research. Less than a majority of adults favor use of animals in research, and yet close to 90% of scientists do. So there are some vast differences in terms of how the public perceives, for example, genetically modified foods or use of animals in research. So those are probably areas that if scientists want to keep on moving that work forward, there needs to be a little better communication. On the other end of the spectrum, these have to do with climate change and world population and so on. But down here, favor the increased use of fracking. Both scientists and public tend to be lower on the favorability scale. And whether the space station was a good investment, scientists and the public are quite favorable about that. Now, there are a bunch of subcategories within these in which scientists and non-scientists in society tend to flip-flop on certain topics. And if you're interested in this sort of data, I'd encourage you to look that up. And the websites are listed on here as you go through this. But what's interesting and maybe a little perplexing for me is that while the public still looks upon scientists and scientific applications as favorable, oops, I'm sorry, excuse me, I hit the wrong button here. There's been a decline over the last 5 to 10 years, no, I guess 6 years, 5 years, in the perception of whether or not scientific applications have made life easier or more difficult. So for example, if you say life for most people based on scientific contributions, in 2009, 10% of society felt it was more difficult, where 83% thought it was favorable or easier, but that slipped from 83 to 79%, and 15% of people think that science has actually made life more difficult. That's also occurred in the context of healthcare, food, and safety of food and the environment. So there have been some shifts, and it's unclear whether it's the actual applications of science or the policies regulating the science. It was hard to sort of tease that out, but there is a shift in terms of the public perception of how science is being applied to make life easier. So this is a paper that's a few years old, but it has some highlights in it that I wanted to share with you related to editors of one of the online open access journals through or PLOS, Medicine Editors. It was published a few years ago. That comments, and this is editorial, but so take that with a grain of salt, but that science should be responsible to society, not necessarily to politics. And here I wrote a few bullet points from this paper where they talk about governments rightly request the advice of scientists on matters of fact that affect the public good, from climate change to cancer screening. Scientists must then assess available data and present recommendations based on the data. But what is the role of scientists when politicians see these recommendations as inconvenient? In other words, at what point do scientists try to come in and communicate evidence on politically volatile topics to the public? In addition, in an enlightened society, they state that surely science must serve and enhance the public good, and even the best medical research will not attain this goal until its significance reaches the policymakers and the public in a way that leads to improvements in health. So communication is a big issue. If science is to offer anything over opinion polls, scientists must report unbiased observations in an objective fashion, whether or not the data are comforting, expected, or even easily understood. And finally, scientists cannot selectively emphasize aspects of their work that will meet the widest approval, as politicians sometimes do. And I dare say, even as scientists, we sometimes gear our research to fit what's fashionable for funding, because there are changes in the fashion of, in what's fundable and what isn't. But however diligently scientists work to ensure the integrity of their work and the accuracy of public perceptions, scientists alone cannot realize the potential of science to improve society. For real progress to occur, those with power to implement change must act on the evidence. And of course, this is again editorializing from scientists' perspective. The politicians must not ignore nor attempt to discredit legitimate science that doesn't happen to support political goals. To do so erodes public trust, not only in scientists, but also in the politicians themselves. So communication is really the key to some of this. And as a scientist, we can communicate through our employers, funding agencies, and disclosures of conflict of interest. And as a citizen, we have to disclose our scientific background. And while freedom of speech is inherently respected and exists for us, it doesn't necessarily guarantee retaining one's job position or funding. So there are a lot of rights and responsibilities that factor into this. And this is a publication that was published in 2005. It's still the most recent publication for this organization, which is put out by the International Strategic Review Committee. And from that, they talk about science and society and rights and responsibilities. So change, scientific technology tends to move faster sometimes than do ethics and policies related to that. So there's challenges to universality, the production of scientific knowledge, risks and uncertainties due to the increasing speed and scale of scientific production, governance and accountability, and the nature of expertise on science and society. So I'm going to go through each of these real quick here. So universality has to do with access to scientific information. And it used to be that travel and internet were key, but now the open access publications, international collaborations are important. The flow of information is what's really increased. Of course, intellectual property, political and technical support are important, but social media plays a big role in this. Representation. For example, years ago, when I was first starting off in research, the big area was representation of research subjects between men and women, because men were preferentially applied in research clinical trials because there was less variability. Well, there was a big push to include representation for women, but there's still a lot of room to include representation in research, either as clinical subjects or research subjects, as well as those producing the science, in terms of gender, ethnicity, race, and culture. And then distribution of resources is also an issue that can affect universality. In terms of production of knowledge, there's a shifting balance between basic science and applied science. At least in biomedical research, there's increasing requirement for deliverables that can be actually what they call translatable or translational science to meet the public demand for improvements in vaccines and treatments and so on. But scientists would often argue that basic science is important as well. So over the years, you'll see shifts in whether there's more funding for basic science versus applied science. Hybridization relating intellectual curiosity and society's needs is important in that context. Such research has become much more multidisciplinary, international collaborations, because the outreach of science affects a broader group of people. And then there's much more interest in seeking private sector funding because of limited funds to the public sector. So there's a lot of issues that need to be addressed in that context as well. Consequences of the production of knowledge. Again, communication is important, and that's improved through open access journals, intellectual property, credit, and publications. There also needs to be fair peer review, so that even if hypotheses that may ask questions that go against the paradigm or the norm, that credence is given to asking questions that do play devil's advocate to some extent. Making sure that conflicts of interest are disclosed, and governance regulations have to be adhered to, both based on government and intergovernment compliance, and that also affects culture, ethics, morals. So there's a lot of redundancy in what I'm saying here. So risk and uncertainty, the intended and unintended consequences are really important. And obviously, any kind of scientific application can be used for deliberate good and deliberate bad or harm. But it's sometimes the unintended consequences that sometimes sneak up on people. So remaining aware and trying to stay attuned to how scientific information is being used is important. Assessment using best practices, understanding what the gaps in knowledge are and what long-term issues might be. Regulation, of course, helps to maintain some control, maintaining high safety standards. However, there's still a disproportionate consequences to the poorest sectors, and that's always something that needs to be taken into consideration. Again, peer review. Some peer review is open, but closed discussions are necessary as well to maintain integrity. So there needs to be integrity in both open and closed discussions, as scientists. And again, communicating with the public to represent the uncertainties, as well as to help establish public confidence in the work that's being done. Accountability and governance involves responsiveness to society's concern. There's, of course, an increased demand for citizen participation as through the workshops that are being held through the AAAS. Credibility and transparency are essential. And also journalism, advertising in the media, that needs to probably involve a little bit more scientific input as well, so that there's fair representation of information. So expectations. This is where there's some issues sometimes, and I'm going to read an example here in a minute where expectations shift over time. Privacy, consent, transparency, professional integrity all factor into this. And here's an example about confidentiality and the use of biological specimens, which I'm going to show in the next slide. I'm going to read this from this report from the International Council for Science on the Science. I just showed you that slide, and the website's on here. But they give about, 15 different scenarios where there are ethical dilemmas. And I used to read several of these, but instead I'm going to give you a top 10 list of impending ethical dilemmas in science that was just published for 2015 that I thought might be a little more interesting. But I did want to read this one just as an example, in which investigating the murder of the Swedish Minister of Foreign Affairs, Anna Lindh, in 2003, the police obtained a sample of blood of a main suspect from a biobank at a university hospital in Stockholm. This bank was established in the mid-1970s, so realize that this is before the era of DNA sequencing and PCR, and it contains over 3 million samples of blood from newly born children. It is used mainly to trace 5 different diseases that may lead to severe disabilities if they are not detected early, as well as for research purposes. It is still unclear whether it was legally permitted to supply the sample to the police. Such use was not included in the original consent agreement with the parents. So, of course, over time, there was a shift in sentiment. So the sample provided strong evidence that the suspect was the murderer and led to his arrest. At the subsequent trial, he was found guilty. This case has led to strong criticism from many parents and others against the hospital. So the question is that there's an urgent need to clarify the legal situation on restrictions on the use of biobanks if future potential donors are not to be discouraged from supplying biological samples for research. Now, laws have changed, of course, with confidentiality and privacy and use, but you can see that when times change and technology changes, and then we go back and there's a lot of blurring about individual rights and rights of society. So those are the kinds of dilemmas that you can probably see popping up in the future. So this is where there's sort of this triangle between sources of expertise, in other words, production of science, bioethics education, and communication between science, society, and then in between all of this, that interface involves the media, government and non-government agencies involved in policies, scientific organizations, the legal system, and then expert commissions on various aspects of ethics, morality, philosophy, culture, and so on. So this gets very complicated for what our role in society should be. This is where I wanted to sort of pique your curiosity and your interest a little bit. I happened to see this in just a trade magazine, Laboratory Equipment, where they described the top 10 ethical dilemmas in science. And apparently, the John R. Riley Center at Notre Dame puts out sort of a top 10 list, and people vote on what's the most prominent or preeminent ethical dilemma in science coming up. Some of these just really floored me, to tell you the truth, and I thought maybe you'd find some of these interesting as well. So it's, again, from the John R. Riley Center, which involves science, technology, and values. So one that has to do with real-time satellite surveillance, in which there are a lot of satellites now that are becoming cheaper, smaller, more sophisticated, and exhibit higher resolution. And these allow clients who buy these satellites or their information to see images of areas coping with natural disasters and humanitarian crises, but they also allow data on the coming and going of private citizens. So questions that were raised were, how do we decide what should be monitored and how often? Should we use this data to solve crimes? What's the potential for abuse by corporations, governments, police departments, private citizens, terrorists, or what they say, bad actors? So, you know, that's kind of interesting, and we know that this is going on right now, so how much privacy do we really have anymore? Another one has to do with astronaut bioethics and colonizing Mars. And apparently there are long-term, plans for space missions to colonize Mars. And apparently, I didn't know this, I knew that there were robotic missions going on to Mars over the next 3 or 4 years, but they plan to have humans following for space missions in 2025. And there are already about 600 or 700 people that have volunteered from around the world that are trying to get on these space missions. And so some of the questions are, is it ethical to expose people to unknown levels of human isolation and physical danger, exposure to radiation or other agents? Will these pioneers lack privacy for the rest of their lives? Is it ethical to conceive or have a birth of a child in Mars? And then where is this child a citizen? And what are the impact on that? So there are a lot of bioethical issues related to colonization of Mars. Another dilemma is wearable technology. I don't know how many of you have those Fitbits that you wear and that sort of thing. Your phones, they all have location trackers. So, obviously, they say literally and figuratively, there are multiple technologies that monitor our behaviors, clip-on devices. They said Google is teaming up with Novartis to create a contact lens that will monitor blood sugar levels and diabetes and send that information to healthcare providers. You can only imagine where that can go with other kinds of devices that we might be using for healthcare. So they said, in addition, employers are experimenting with devices that track volunteer employees' movements, tone of voice, and even posture. So, you can only imagine. So wearable devices, have the potential to educate and protect us in terms of health, but they can also violate our privacy in a number of ways. So again, policies are going to be coming into place, and this is driven by science technology, of course. State-sponsored hacktivism, or what they call cyber war. We've seen how various governments are now getting into hacking, the Chinese hacking and government retribution, and so where are the bounds? There are questions about the bounds. How do we fight back? There's concerns about hacking into various infrastructure grids with utilities. So, where is the offense and defense, and where does that balance into the equation? Enhanced pathogens. Many of you are probably familiar with studies to actually increase virulence and pathogenicity of viruses such as influenza, SARS, and MERS. And the White House recently suspended that research, even though it might provide vital insights into targeting how to destroy these organisms. But if they were to escape and cause a threat to society, there's obviously concerns in that regard. Then this one, it was a little counterintuitive, but they talked about the development of non-lethal weapons. And on the surface, you'd think that, boy, non-lethal weapons would be better than lethal weapons. But it turns out that really these are sort of used to escalate wars and violence. And basically to inactivate. Let me read some of this. Blinding weapons, pain rays, sonic weapons, electric weapons, heat rays, disabling malodorants, as well as uses of gases and sprays to be used both in military and domestic police forces. But they can also cause serious pain, physical injuries, and long-term health consequences that then have an impact on public health service providers. So the issue here also is whether or not there should be a lot of money spent toward these kind of weapons that can increase violence altogether. Then robot swarms. I didn't know too much about this either, but apparently at Harvard University they created a swarm of over 1,000 robots that are capable of communicating with each other and performing simple tasks such as arranging themselves into shapes and patterns, and they call these kilobots. Their intention is it's sort of with the driverless cars or automatic performance functions, and they're also intended for performing environmental cleanups or to respond to disasters where perhaps that would otherwise put humans at risk. The concerns are responsibility and implications of letting robots be programmed in ways that might harm society. Who would we blame for accidents or sabotage or spying? So there are issues related to that. Artificial life forms. Again, instead of trying to break apart life forms to understand how life mechanisms, biology, chemistry, so on, operate, there are factors related to actually creating life and inserting synthetic DNAs to create life forms. Of course, there's safety issues, issues relating to ethics and playing God, so to speak. Patenting becomes an issue, and then whether these life forms could become used as biological weapons. And this resilient social ecological system relates to balancing ecology and society in ways that can be pushed to the extreme while still maintaining functionality. And this is related to issues such as global climate change, natural disaster, and economic globalization or disasters. So issues here relate to how it's maintained, who has oversight, what cultural and ethical issues should be overseeing these systems. And then the last one is the brain-to-brain interfaces that are coming into play. Apparently, some of these techniques have started to be applied using an electron encephalography machine that detects brainwave activity in the sender, and then was used with a transcranial magnetic simulation coil that controls movement in the receiver. And this was achieved twice between humans, as well as an interspecies brain-to-brain interface where a signal from a human brain that was generated induced a flashing light and caused a rat tail several, I don't know how far away, to move. So apparently there are these signaling systems now that can brain interfaces, and then of course issues relate to hackers and who wants control of their thoughts being broadcast out there. So a lot of interesting dilemmas, some that I hadn't even considered before. So and of course I wanted to bring up just one issue that constantly keeps coming up over and over again, having to do with vaccinations. And this was back in 2011 when the influenza vaccine, there were a lot of discussions. The public still has strong concerns about autism, even though the original cases linking vaccination and autism were thrown out of court. And even the physician who published this lost his medical license. But that still keeps coming up every once in a while. And even as recently as a year ago, with the measles outbreak that happened then, as well as more recently at Disney World, there's still a lot of debate that relates to whether vaccinations should be mandatory, how safe are they, should individuals have the right to make those decisions, or should this be government decided policies for benefit of the public. And so there's still debate about these issues that as scientists, obviously, we need to consider that. So one place that sort of gives a list again of just some sort of take-home messages for scientists that's based on this book that Dr. Andrew Maynard, who's at University of Michigan Risk Science Center, published a few years ago and was recently republished again, relates to communicating clearly to society, ensuring unbiased reporting by the media. So in other words, in social media, it's important that we also reflect data as unbiased as we can, considering the ethics that theoretically knowledge is neutral, but it's the application of knowledge that becomes ethically challenging. And that the statement that science is merely one version of the truth. It's not absolute. And we know that just because technology changes and as more information comes along, the interpretation of data and what we consider knowledge evolves as well. There's a statement about avoiding arrogance, be aware of limitations of personal expertise, participating in fair peer reviews so that scientists can play devil's advocate with their research and ask questions that may go against the tide. Be aware of limitations. Also understand governments have vested interests that impact endeavor, the scientific endeavor that again improves society's conditions and so on. Be aware of commercial interests, and again, this is important to be transparent and maintain public trust. Commercial interests can be good or bad again. Academia is sometimes perceived as being closed off for the public, so again, community outreach is considered an issue, and promoting the education of the public about science. Furthermore, there was an interest in appreciating the contribution of science in the arts and culture and religion, because theoretically, people consider that these complement each other. So finally, getting back to the roles of the road, there are a lot of things to consider in terms of honesty, accuracy, efficiency, and objectivity. But it's mainly those are the four key elements to this. And so the take-home messages are to consider both scientific as well as social well-being. When publishing, make sure everything is done as accurately with the best integrity as possible, disclosing conflicts of interest, and being responsible social media participant. And I think that's it. So there's a lot of information, a lot of food for thought, but I hope it at least gets you thinking about different ways to look at how science can be used for both good and bad, and trying to push the good. So, okay, thanks. Okay, are there any questions at all, or? Oh, yes, huh?
Just about the current situation with the primate survey.
Yes. Okay, I'll answer as best I can, but I'm not official spokesman, so.
But I think it's, whatever knows what.
Rather timely, isn't it?
Whatever you're putting in the newspaper, I'm sure it's just as much of it, but I think it's an amazing example of what you're talking about.
Absolutely. So, communication is 95% of this. And it's interesting because I think there's a huge learning curve, and Brian and I were talking a little bit about this earlier. As the Primate Center, obviously we try to do the best science. We have a lot of training. We have wonderful scientists, veterinarians, technicians, strong leadership, and things happen. And of course, right away when this happened, we reported to the CDC. Now, this is my understanding, and I'm not official spokesman, and I hope I don't hear about this when I go back. But we report to federal agencies, and that was done promptly. But a single test doesn't tell you everything. It's important to see a second test because antibody titers can go up, can go down, or can stay the same. And that tells us different scenarios. So if the antibody titer is going up, it's a recent exposure. If the titer is going down, it's probably a clearing of an infection. And if it stays the same, the exposure probably did not happen recently. So a positive test can occur, but it doesn't mean that the exposure occurred at the Primate Center. It might have happened before. So information was coming out based on single tests, and until we got a second test, we didn't know how to respond. We would communicate with the CDC, but it wasn't, the CDC had to communicate. We couldn't communicate for the CDC, so sometimes it takes a little time for that communication to come out. And I think as things start to come out, I think the public, as well, especially at the North Shore, is starting to see that there's a process through which the CDC communicates, and then the state officials are informed, and then the local citizens are informed. Fortunately, there's not been a single human exposure. Any human positive test turned out to be an antibody titer that remained the same, which means that if there had been exposure, it's either cross-reactive to something else, or it occurred probably over a year before that. Now, needless to say, there were some animals that became infected. Most of them do not show clinical signs. It looks like there was some transmission in one of the clinics, but how that initial index case occurred, they're treating it in the most conservative way as though it was an escape from the lab. That's the most conservative, the most cautious approach to take. But I don't think that's been proven. That's just the working scenario to contain and then identify. So, we're reviewing all the protocols and going back, and I think there's some fine tuning that's going on. And, we learn from mistakes. I think that's what I always tell my kids, don't always think that making a mistake is a bad thing. You're going to learn from it and be better prepared in the future. So I think that's how this is going to roll out as well. But anyway, do you have any more questions? I hope I don't. Did you catch me okay? If I said anything,
I guess just to clarify, when you say conservative approach, it's the most cautious.
Cautious is, but when I said conservative, I meant cautious, yes. You always want to play worst case scenario of what happened, but that's not necessarily what did happen. We're sort of still, the jury's out on that one, I would say. So.
I just have a comment. I think one of the problems that I've been noticing is I think the general public is losing trust in scientists. And I think when you have some like vaccine issue coming up, no matter how much data we produce, you don't trust it.
Yeah.
They just keep, like, oh, you're covering it up, because you want general society. And it's like, what do you do as a scientist when you lose public trust?
Yeah. That's a tough one. I think all you can do is set the example. I mean, for example, when people ask me about vaccination, I said, well, I vaccinated my kids, and I wouldn't do that if I didn't trust that this was the safe way to go. Sometimes it's prudent to be cautious and concerned and maybe wait to see if there's more data. I don't know that there's a one-size-fits-all, but it's some of that loss of trust is when papers aren't published because the editors might have had a certain point of view, or when people use false data or fabricate data. And, I think there's a lot of rigor in the universities to really tamp down on that and to deal with it quickly. So, I guess my best advice is just setting the best example, doing things as honestly, being as open, giving the pros and the cons for any one issue, because ultimately we all have to make our own decisions about what we think is best for our family and our kids and so on. But the social media has really just opened up so many, opportunities for sort of headline information rather than data and facts and exploring that. And I guess I'm sort of beating around the corner, but I don't know that I have a really good answer for that, except to.
I think that's unfortunate.
And that probably explains a little bit of that downtick in terms of the, positive view of, of the society on science. It went down by 4 or 5%. So that's probably reflected a little bit there too.
I think part of that too is, I'm older than most of y'all, and what passes for news nowadays, Walter Cronkite would never have done that.
It's a different world.
They take the most sensational and the most extreme cases they can find, and that's what they throw at everybody, and that's what makes people start believing crazy stuff. And, it almost seems to me like there should be some scientific group that's prepared to rebut that.
Well, they're like with the AAAS, they have these workshops to interface. And, I think that's one of the responsibilities maybe we have as scientists is when we're on social media to try and represent the facts and the information as clearly as we can, as non-confrontationally. We all have our points of view, and I certainly know I'm about as opinionated as they come, but, we have to act to persuade. And, it's.
But, like the president gives the State of the
right?
Union and the opposition gives their response.
Yeah.
There should be some way of being able to respond more quickly than a journal that's going to come out, 3 months from now.
Yeah. Well, and, that's part of education too. And I think that's what one of the issues is to help better educate our kids in terms of scientific issues and the scientific process too. So.
Dr. Oz is far more effective than the New England Journal.
Oh, God, don't even get me started.
I think you bring up a great point, and where you actually needed people that know what they're doing, because science and public there's a huge gap. You can't have a common layperson understand science. Even people specializing in that field have a hard time understanding. So when you have reporters that don't have any science background, all interpreting science, that's where you get the problem.
Yeah, and even with the primate center issue, we'd read articles where there are particles of bacteria in the monkey's blood, and it's really the antibodies to the bacteria, but it can get misconstrued as, oh, they were infected, when really they probably weren't. So little things like that can get misconstrued. But I guess that's where we just have to keep communicating. And you know, in many of the grant application processes nowadays, there are often requests for abstracts that are written for the lay person. And so as scientists, we probably have to learn to communicate in a way that the layman can understand, using, you know, not using jargon, but really explaining things a little more accurately. But of course, then we worry that we're glossing over the surface and not getting into the meat of things. So yeah, it's not easy. So, okay.
I mean, I think part of the community participation in research and science will help too.
Yes.
Because I mean, often things are communicated sort of, you know, from top to bottom,
Yeah.
and
in impersonal ways where you're not. But what's interesting is they're going to have a meeting next week up in Mandeville, you know, through the parish council, where both scientists and community, you know, citizens are going to interface. And I think that'll be far more productive, because then you're dealing with people face to face. And I think you build a little more trust that way too. Whereas when you're twittering and this and that, you don't know who's sending what, and it's too easy to let emotions get away from you too. So. Okay. Well, thanks so much for your questions. I really appreciate it.